Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, Raphael. Now for you young people, I'm not talking about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I'm talking about great artists who have lived and have created some of the most well-known and inspirational artwork. Men like Monet or Vincent van Gogh. You think about some of these artists and their artwork. You might think about Leonardo da Vinci and some of the art that he's known for. Most notably, the Mona Lisa and the painting of the Last Supper. People are pretty familiar with those two particular works. You might think about Michelangelo and some of the things that he's most noted for. And one of those is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel located in Rome. Or Donatello, who was considered one of the greatest sculptors to have ever lived. And one of his most famous works is the bronze statue of David. And of course, Vincent van Gogh and his painting Starry Night. Great works of art. It reminds me of an episode of the Andy Griffith Show, and you're probably familiar with this one if you've ever watched any of that show at all, where Barney buys that car off of Mrs. Lesh, and of course it's a lemon. And as Barney is taking the gang out for a Sunday drive, they pass the Johnson farm. And they start talking about how the Johnsons keep their farm up better than anybody. To which Gomer chimes in and says, their farm's a picture no artist could draw. When you think about Psalm 139, Psalm 139 paints us a portrait of God that no artist could ever adequately brush onto canvas. This morning's sermon is entitled A Portrait of God That No Artist Can Draw. In Psalm 139, David details and highlights 4 attributes of God that helps us to see how marvelous our God truly is. We're going to talk about God's omniscience this morning. And if the Lord wills, tonight we'll discuss the other 3, which are His omnipresence, His omnipotence, and one that we discussed last week, but we'll discuss it once again, just briefly, His righteousness. Because all 4 of these attributes are discussed, highlighted in Psalm 139. The first 6 verses, if you have your Bibles, when you think about the omniscience of God, what does that mean? That's a fancy word, isn't it? We don't go around talking about omniscience very often. It's not a word that we use in our everyday vernacular. But it basically is a word that means all-knowing. And God is all-knowing. In Psalm 44 and verse 21, it says that He knows the secrets of the heart. Proverbs 15 and verse number 3, His eyes are in every place, and His understanding is infinite. Psalm 147 and verse number 5. But as you look at Psalm 139, notice its opening refrain. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. If you were to break that down literally, it would say, O Lord, you have searched me through and through, and you know me completely. I'll read those words and I'm overcome with this feeling of comfort, with this feeling of just peacefulness, because God knows everything about me. He knows my anxieties. He knows my fears. He knows what makes me happy. He knows what makes me sad. He knows what makes me angry. And most importantly, He knows my heart. When you think about that word searched that is used here, it means to pierce or to bore, as one would a hole in the ground. David here illustrates how God has performed an excavation upon him. I'm sure you have watched documentaries on National Geographic or the Discovery Channel where they're talking about some type of archaeological discovery, where they might be digging up an old relic, maybe dinosaur bones, or they might be trying to uncover the remains of an ancient civilization. This is basically what God is described as doing here in Psalm 139 to David, that He is brushing away the dirt and getting the intricate and getting insight into the intricate details of David's life. And he is absolutely thorough in doing it. In verses 2 and 3, it says, you know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thought afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. God's knowledge being infinite here means that He knows altogether everything about us. Every thought we have, every word that we might speak. In other words, God knows what we say, what we mean when we say it, and He knows if our words are false. He knows if they are hypocritical, or He knows if they are true. David understood that he was a finite being. In verse number 5 it says, you have hedged me behind and before, and laid your hands upon me. And he understood that God was infinite and beyond comprehension. In verse 6 he says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. What a picture of God. You think about God all-knowing, His omniscience. God knows every past, present, and future action. He knows every human thought. He knows every human need. And God knows what is absolutely right God's omniscience concerns His infinite knowledge. It comes from the word omnis, which means all, and scientia, which means knowledge. Thus, He is all-knowing. In 1 Samuel, chapter 16 and verse 7, speaking of when Samuel was called to anoint a successor to King Saul. You know that God took away the kingdom from Saul because of his disobedience in 1 Samuel chapter 15. And so there was this thought that He was going to choose another person like Samuel, who was head and shoulders above everybody. But He chose David. And it says that man looks upon the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. In 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 39, after the Ark of the Covenant had been brought into the newly constructed temple that Solomon built, and Solomon was dedicating the temple. In verse 39, Solomon made this statement about God, that He knows thoroughly the hearts of all the sons of men. He is conscious of the activities of the entire earth, as we notice there in Proverbs 15 and verse 3, where it talks about how God's eyes are upon every place. In 2 Chronicles chapter 16 and verse 9, it says, the eyes of God run to and fro throughout the whole earth. And He knows the details of the most intricate parts of us. In Psalm 119 and verse 168, it says, you are acquainted with all of my ways. God has the ability to know the future just as He knows the past and the present. Isaiah affirmed that Jehovah could declare the end from the beginning, and even things not yet done. Isaiah chapter 46, verses 9 and 10. You know, think about this quality of God is evidenced repeatedly throughout the Bible, and especially as it relates to prophecy. That God, centuries in advance, could depict explicitly things that would transpire in the future. You think about the Old Testament and the many prophecies concerning the coming of the Messiah. There are at least 333 of them in the Old Testament. And each one of them is very detailed. For instance, would Isaiah talk about Him being born of a virgin? Or what he talked about in Isaiah 53, and how the Messiah would be led as a sheep to the slaughter, and that through His wounds we would be healed. There was the prophecies concerning John the Baptizer and how he would come to prepare the way for the Lord. That he would be the essence of the coming of Elijah. God knows the details. He knows the intricacies of each one of us. He knows our hearts, knows our fears, knows our anxieties. When you start thinking about the omniscience of God, though, there are some who would like to push back on that idea and say that God doesn't know everything. That He actually chooses to limit His knowledge. Therefore, electing to not know, certain things. Some have alleged that He limits His knowledge, and that there is scriptural evidence to back this up. One of the things that they allege is that God didn't know that Abraham would obey Him. You might remember God told Abraham to take Isaac, his son, and offer him up on the mountain. In Genesis chapter 22 and verse 12, as Abraham was about to take the knife to his son, God stopped him and said, "Now I know that you fear God." To which some have alleged that God didn't know that Abraham feared Him, or that Abraham wasn't going to do what he said he was going to do. But what they fail to realize is that the Bible often uses what we might refer to as accommodative language. And I'm going to use another big word here, a couple of them. Both of them sound quite the same. One of them is called anthropomorphism, which carries with it the idea that when God, in something is describing God, concerning God about something, and they attribute physical traits or physical qualities such as an arm or his ear. We think about Isaiah chapter 59, verses 1 and 2, where it talks about God, our sins separate us from God, where his ears are deaf to us, or his arms are shortened that he can't help us. And we know that God doesn't physically have an arm or an ear, because it says in John chapter 4 and verse 24 that God's Spirit. But that's accommodative language to help us realize or understand that, to help us in our infinite way of God. And the other word is anthropopathism, which attributes certain human emotions. So anthropomorphism assigns physical traits, and anthropopathism attributes emotions or feelings, which is accommodative language that is used to help us understand who God is and how God responds to us, in a sense, in our interactions. In Genesis chapter 6 and verse 6, you might remember how God, some translations use the word repented, that He had made man upon the earth, because He looked down upon the earth and He saw how man was so wicked, or that He was sorry. That's accommodative language. That's that anthropopathism, attributing emotions to God to illustrate to us, in this particular case, His displeasure in how man was conducting himself. Some have suggested that Jesus limited His foreknowledge as God incarnate. One instance was in Mark chapter 11, when He came upon a fig tree to see if there was going to be something on there to eat. And when He got there wasn't anything on there. And He said, "Well, may you not ever bear fruit ever again." And the other time was in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 36, when He says that, "I don't know when I'm returning, but only God knows." But these self-imposed limitations of knowledge in no way undermines Jesus' divine nature. In this particular case, this might have more to do with that emptying process. Remember, in the book of Philippians, the Apostle Paul describes Jesus as having emptied Himself and took the form of a human being took the role of a bondservant, came in the likeness of man, and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. But it does not suggest that God the Father has limited knowledge in any way. And some have alleged that if God knows everything of the future, such as the fact that we'll sin, they conclude that He chooses not to know our individual actions, and that He enables us to not be able to control our ability to make choices. But the fact is that God knows, as we've talked about, what a person will do, but it does not mean that He is going to remove our free will, and that He's not going to force us to act a certain way. God knew, for example, both Jeremiah and Paul, even before they were born. Jeremiah 1 and verse 5 and Galatians chapter 1 and verse 15. And yet it was their choice to follow the Lord. They were not predestined to do so, irrespective of their wills. And so similarly, Jesus knew from the beginning of His ministry who would betray Him. John 6 and verse 64. And yet Judas acknowledged, when you go back and read, when Judas betrayed Jesus, that he actually took responsibility for his actions. In Matthew chapter 27 and verse 4, he went back to the religious leaders and says, I have betrayed innocent blood. He tried to give back the money, because it was for by transgression that Judas fell. Acts 1 and verse 25. Lord, you have searched me. He has excavated David's heart, and in like manner we should allow Him to excavate our hearts as well, because He knows the intricate details of us. Like we said, He knows everything about us. He knows the very number of hairs that are on our heads. He says that we are of more value than many sparrows. The Apostle Peter and Paul respectively said that we are to cast all of our anxieties and all of our cares upon Him, because He cares for us. Because He's not willing that any of us should perish, but that we should all have everlasting life. This is just a brief glimpse into the omniscience of God, that He is all-knowing. We could discuss this for days if we wanted to, but hopefully this has given you a little bit of an overview, food for thought, perhaps to whet your appetite to further, study this in even more detail. And hopefully you'll be back tonight, if the Lord wills, to talk about His omnipresence, His omnipotence, and His righteousness. But for now, the lesson is yours. This time we'll extend the Lord's invitation. Perhaps there's someone here in our audience that has never obeyed the gospel. The Bible teaches us that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 7 through 9, that Jesus will be revealed with His holy angels in flaming fire, taking vengeance upon them who know not God and upon those who do not obey the gospel. The gospel is, in its basic form, is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's the truth about the kingdom, His church, the fact that He established the church, that He was going to build His church, Matthew chapter 16 and verse 18. That not only is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and understanding that essential salvation, but also understanding that about the church is just as essential, because it was those things that were taught to the Samaritans in Acts chapter 8 concerning Jesus and concerning the things pertaining to the kingdom. In Acts chapter 8, when Philip went to teach the Ethiopian eunuch, and starting from Isaiah chapter 53, he began to preach Jesus to him. And as they traveled along, they came upon a body of water, and the Ethiopian wanted to know what was hindering him from being baptized. And so we know that preaching Jesus also involved preaching baptism, which makes sense because Jesus Himself said to His disciples, "Go and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believes and is baptized, immersed, shall be saved. He who does not believe shall be condemned." And it's through that act that we call upon the name of the Lord, Acts 22 and verse 16. If you're here this morning and are subject to the invitation, we invite you to come as we together stand and sing.